Hello everyone and welcome back to Crypto's News for this special video so you can inform yourselves in the space on maybe a different side of what you looked at. It is me, your favorite cryptocurrency YouTube host, Omar Bam. Pleasure to have you. Order $100 or more at crypto-hwwallet.com using my referral link below to receive $5 off your order. Also, be sure to pick up one of their new genuine leather cases for your Ledger Blue Keep Key or Treasure and rock them in style. And how? Hey guys, nice to have you as always. So we are going to be reading together here two really important articles so you can make the best judgment for yourself. I would love for you to partake in the discussion because I know this is extremely just a new world for a lot of people when it comes to Bitcoin and cryptocurrency and understanding blockchains. We're going to break down Segwit2x. We're going to break down segregated witness. We're going to break down Bitcoin Cash a little bit. And we're going to break down possibly a new version of Bitcoin coming up in about 3 months and what could lead up into it so that you can position yourselves in the right place. So, yeah, I'm Omar Bam and it's good to have you. So there are two things that I found. Janelle, my girlfriend, actually found this inside of our Facebook group. Make sure you join up. People are constantly posting stuff there, and she notified me about this. And I thought that this article did a very good job of being as objective as this individual could be in describing the circumstances we find ourselves in. And then it leads into another one that could be a possible black swan event for Bitcoin that you should be aware of that possibly started today when the profitability of Bitcoin finally was less than Bitcoin Cash and what could happen leading forward. I need to make sure I get you guys out there. I feel like it's almost a duty of mine to share this with you. It's important. It's really important. I don't think there are enough people talking about it. Excellent article here. I'm going to link to it below. Make sure that you read it yourself. And I'm going to try to break it down in such a way so that you understand. I was trying to explain it to Janelle as well. We were learning about this together, just like breaking it down so we would both get it. And we're going to do the same with you now. So last week, this is by Bellerophon. Oh no, this is the wrong one. Okay. Let's start off with an article entitled I Looked into Segwit and Here's What I Saw, by ModProbe on Steemit. Published 19 days ago. In light of the upcoming Bitcoin fork, I finally decided to look into exactly what Segwit is and form my own opinions based on the technical and economic realities, rather than on opinions and impressions I found online. In this post, I will share what I learned, where I'm coming from. But first, a little background about my history with crypto and my perspective on this debate. I first encountered Bitcoin reading an article which talked about it as digital money, but didn't delve into the blockchain technology that powers it. I don't know when this was, but I'll take a stab. I say it was probably 2011, 2012. I got interested in mined a little with my GPU and played around with it, sending between a couple of wallets, but I didn't seriously look into the technology behind it. That's kind of like most of us. You know, this is interesting. Oh, it's digital money. Let me try to mine and make a little bit of money. But he didn't really entrance himself in the beauty of it, of what many have seen the beauty to be, for maybe a few more years. So later, circa 2014, I encountered blockchain for the first time and quickly recognized the power and potential of the technology. Blockchain represents a quantum leap in what is technically possible with software, and even at the beginning, I knew it would fundamentally change the world. This happened as I was finishing my master's degree in computer science, smart guy, so I decided to pursue a profession in blockchain technology. To understand my perspective on the Bitcoin fork, it is helpful to bear in mind that I have never been as passionate about Bitcoin as I am about blockchain. And while I love Bitcoin for what it is, I regard it as a prototype of the blockchain, but not necessarily the end-all, be-all cryptocurrency. I remember there was a year when I was first girding into it, when the buzzword on Twitter around the whole world wasn't Bitcoin. Everyone was using hashtag blockchain because what Bitcoin did was present the word blockchain to everyone, but it wasn't the end all be all. That was a really big movement for I think about 2 years. From a technology standpoint, the Bitcoin chain is clumsy, unpredictable, and slow. To break into the blockchain space, I first worked on BitShares, which I have some friends say, smart dudes, it's the best blockchain out there, technology that exists. The guy creating EOS, the guy who created Steemit, Dan Larimer, really smart guy in this space. So I first worked on BitShares, and we created a blockchain with a reliably scheduled block production every 5 seconds, later upgraded to 3 seconds, capable of processing thousands of transactions per second and requiring only one confirmation for reasonable certainty of transaction permanence under normal network conditions. Bitcoin, in contrast, produces blocks at random times, can process about 7 transactions per second, compared to thousands, and requires an unpredictable delay of a recommended 6 confirmations for transaction permanence. To be fair though, my off-the-cuff estimate is that 2 or 3 Bitcoin confirmations give similar certainty as 1 BitShares confirmation. That's huge. In my view, Bitcoin's redeeming quality is its network effect. A lot of people use it and a lot of merchants accept it, usually through BitPay, that company that we're hearing a lot about. When I say Bitcoin nowadays, a lot of people out there know what I'm talking about. I think we can do better than Bitcoin technologically. So for fancy features and high speed, I'd say to use a different chain. The best thing Bitcoin can do is keep working as smoothly as it's capable of and stay simple and secure enough that just about everyone can understand and rely on it. So if you don't know, one of the things that is happening, because I think it's important for you to know in the news today, is that BitPay allows merchants all over the world to accept Bitcoin and change for local currencies. They only accept Bitcoin, so one blockchain of Bitcoin, and they are one of the people who signed up for Segwit2x, that agreement we're going to get into. But yeah, they have built a lot of the infrastructure for most merchants nowadays, the majority of them, to accept Bitcoin. So that's why we see a big network effect with Bitcoin, and that's a big redeeming quality for it. So what's broken in Bitcoin? Now that I've shared a little bit about my history in blockchains, let's talk about what the problems are with Bitcoin. The main issue is quite simply that Bitcoin's popularity is rising and 7 transactions per second simply isn't enough anymore. Some secondary issues are non-critical bugs in Bitcoin, like transaction malleability, that have already been worked around in wallets, but we'd like to solve them once and for all so wallet makers don't have to worry about them anymore. So what he is saying here is that Segwit, segregated witness, will fix something called transaction malleability. Quick description of that is that it would allow, if I send the transaction, it's going to take a while for you to confirm that transaction if you're an exchange or if you are a person, individual. So you could request a certain amount of Bitcoin from me, and in the time it takes for me to create the transaction, send the Bitcoin over, and for it to be mined or whatever, to be confirmed officially, I could literally change it myself a little bit, the transaction, and you'd be like, hey, I didn't get it, or I sent it to you. For example, if you're an exchange sending it to me, I'd be like, no, I didn't get it. And then in the meantime, I actually did. I just changed the way things worked, or I would get it later on the blockchain. So it allows people to double spend and to make transactions malleable. The miners give them a little bit of control. That's why we see exchanges like Coinbase, like Bittrex, like Poloniex all over. Even wallets do this, where they need multiple confirmations of blocks before they accept it as a real, legit, authentic transaction. So Segwit would fix this transaction malleability issue, which is definitely an issue, but has been worked around with these wallets and exchanges by waiting a little bit longer. But it would be great to not to have wallet makers have to worry about this anymore. So the 7 transaction limit is really due to Bitcoin's 1 megabyte block size limit. If we get a new block on average every 10 minutes, that means there's 1 megabyte, which is 1024 times 1024 bytes. So 1 megabyte is that many bytes of space for transactions, which is 1,048,576 bytes, which is room for around 4,200 small transactions, maybe around 250 bytes each, which divided by 10 minutes equals 600 seconds. Give 4,200 divided by 600 equals 7 transactions per second. Obviously, if Bitcoin is to scale to be a mainstream worldwide cryptocurrency, 7 transactions is simply not enough. Strategies for fixing Bitcoin. As far as I'm aware, the secondary issues in Bitcoin, such as transaction malleability, are simple and straightforward to fix, and I haven't heard of much controversy around these. The big debate is over how to increase the transaction capacity of the chain. I know of 2 main approaches for doing this: segregated witness, or Segwit, and simply raising the 1 megabyte block size limit. It could be 4 megabytes, 8 megabytes, it could be 3 terabytes, whatever, raising that. So I will now explore each of these strategies in more detail. So what is Segwit? Segwit is a relatively simple concept, but a massively complex technical change with an untold morass of technical, economic, and political implications. To understand Segwit, we must first understand the structure of a simple Bitcoin transaction. Every Bitcoin transaction contains inputs coming in and outputs going out. The inputs specify which existing Bitcoins should be moved, and the outputs specify where they should be moved to. The sum of the Bitcoin in the outputs must not exceed the sum of the Bitcoin in the inputs. Otherwise, a transaction would be spending more Bitcoin than it has. And if the outputs adds up to less, than the inputs, so I inputted less, the leftover is a fee for the miners for processing the transaction. Every output has data attached to it. This is important. Specifies the rules for claiming and spending its Bitcoins. And every input has data attached to it, which proves that it follows the rules for the output it claims. So in a nutshell, what you have is there are no actual physical tokens, right? What's happening here when you send a transaction is there's just code being sent around saying how many balances exist where, on which wallets, whatever, which keys. So you have two parts in a transaction. So you have the output, where those Bitcoin are going, input, where they're coming from. So if I make a transaction, I want to send Jimmy and Sally some Bitcoin I can make, and I have 3 Bitcoin come in. I want to send 2 to Jimmy and 1 to Sally. So I have to have 3 Bitcoin coming in order to send 3 out and divide that as the outputs. The thing is, if I was to try to get out, instead 2.8 between Sally and Jimmy, only 2.8 Bitcoin, and I still brought in 3, there would be a 0.2 difference there in the amount of Bitcoin being in there. So there's an extra sum there that's not being sent out to these 2 fine chaps. So instead, that's the fee paid to the network, to the miners for mining that transaction. So that's really what it is. You have inputs, outputs, and a little bit of data next to those inputs and outputs, a little bit of extra data that says how this will work, which addresses can claim what balances and how they're going to be used and go where. That information is absolutely necessary in order to enforce the rules for how a transaction works. You have just numbers, and then you have important rules for spending that Bitcoin. Just those pieces. So Segwit names these attached pieces of data. It gives a name to these extra bits of data that are important, called witness data, and asserts that this data is not important for determining how many Bitcoins belong to each address, but only for determining whether a transaction is authorized to claim certain Bitcoins or not. Segwit creates a new storage space in Bitcoin's blocks, which is not subject to the 1 megabyte size limit that we previously talked about, but instead has its own 0.7 megabyte limit. So every block has a 1 megabyte size limit. You can only fit a certain amount of transactions. So what Segwit would do is take that extra data we talked about in the inputs and outputs, take it out of the blockchain directly and put it on a following bit of storage space that follows each block that has a 0.7 megabyte limit in addition to that 1 megabyte limit. So now in the regular Bitcoin blocks, you don't have to have that extra data. You can attach it to it on a separate bit attached to that, talking to that block that has a 0.7 megabyte limit. So this moves the witness data, those extra rules, to this new storage space. This frees up some room in the 1 megabyte space for more transactions, which can store their witness data in the new storage space. Trunk space. In practice, this should increase the blockchain's transaction capacity. But by how much is a complicated topic due to Segwit's new data weight requirements and fee structures. I won't get into this, but many argue that it is naively optimistic to assume Segwit will yield a significant transaction capacity increase at all, especially in the short term. I've heard that argument, which is that Segwit will take time in order to actually lower transaction fees and allow things to fit the way they should. So it might not actually do that much in the beginning. So what about raising the limit? Or as Janelle said, which is like, just taking that data out there is supposed to help that much? That's true. So what about raising the limit? Raising the block size limit is a trivial change to the Bitcoin code. It's been done before, and its only real effect is to increase the rate at which the blockchain history grows, because it's processing more transactions in the same amount of time. The complaint against raising this limit is that if the chain history grows too fast, it may price out some users from running Bitcoin nodes because they can't afford the disk space to store this history. And full Bitcoin nodes must keep the entire blockchain history. A node is, for example, a wallet. I'm running a full Bitcoin wallet, and that's a node. I have to have my computer connected to the Bitcoin network on the internet and using bandwidth in order to make sure that every single block I'm looking at, my wallet is looking at my software and ensuring that it's accurate and it's fair. So it goes back all the way to the first block, all the way to this moment's block, and has to be downloaded by your wallet. That's a node. Or if you're a miner, you run a node in the form of you have to have that node running so you see all the transactions that ever happen so you can mine the next block. That's also considered a node. One node equals one vote in the system. Once you get over 51%, you can, of that vote, you can really alter how the Bitcoin network upgrades itself. So it's all about getting that consensus about what to do with things based on how many nodes exist. So, where were we? So, Bitcoin nodes, they can't afford disk space to store this history. This history, if it gets to these huge 8 megabyte blocks, you're going to need a little bit more storage space. You're going to have to buy more hard drive space in order to get those transactions on your network. If you guys are using wallets and those wallets are running really, really quickly and they're not taking hours like my Ethereum Mist wallet did, or days or weeks like my Zencash one did, I think Zencash was a few days, a couple of days, in order to download the entire blockchain before you can even send funds to that wallet, then what you're probably tapping into is either somebody else's node where they downloaded the whole blockchain, like if you're going to Coinbase.com and they are running the node for you, but somebody is doing that work, or whatever other company which is running what's considered like a light wallet that only looks at certain parts of the node of the blockchain, for example, of those transactions. So what they're saying here is some people can't afford to store this history. The main questions to be answered when adjusting Bitcoin's max block size limit are what to set the limit to, one, or two, how to calculate the limit. How do we calculate that? In case of one, we just change the number from 1 megabyte to something else. And the question is what? Larger numbers mean more transactions, which means more people can use it, but at the cost of a faster growing history. Bitcoin Cash proposes to set this limit to 8 megabytes and remove Segwit. Note that with 8 megabyte blocks, we wouldn't necessarily see big blocks this immediately, as A, there might not be enough transactions to use that space, and B, miners could easily and safely set lower limits for their own blocks if they felt 8 megabyte is too high for now. So that's what we saw with this proposed solution, Bitcoin Unlimited back, which was that if, like, we would have variable block sizes, for example. So if I feel as a miner that it's too high, I could just say I only want to accept transactions up to this size. That way I don't have to run and buy a bunch of hard drive space if the blockchain randomly just jumps up and then comes back down. I can adjust that as necessary. However, keep in mind that storage space has been dropping drastically as technology evolves due to Moore's law, which was quoted actually in Satoshi's original white paper, which is that every 1.5 years, which it was when it was created, this idea, every 1.5 years technology it's exponential in speed. So it gets half as expensive and double as fast. And we've seen that with solid state drives getting super cheap, increasingly cheap. Hard drive space, 1 terabyte, you can't even imagine what that would have cost you in the year 2005 and how much that would cost you now. What, $80 maybe, $70? So it was expected by Satoshi that this would happen and hardware would upgrade as necessary. However, if it wasn't necessary, it doesn't matter, because if the blocks didn't fill up, you could say, I don't want to mine transactions that big anyway if you couldn't afford it for now. Because some places in the world, they might not be able to afford as quickly as we might in the United States or elsewhere, these bigger blocks. In the case of two, in the case of number 2, which was miners could easily and safely set lower limits for their blocks, they felt 8 megabyte is too high for now. In the case of 2, we abandoned the notion of a single max block size limit for everyone and come up with a new plan for setting it. Bitcoin Limited proposing to let each miner decide this limit for himself in his own blocks and take the risk that if he sets his limit too high, other miners may reject his block for being too big, but if he sets his limit too low, he gives up the fees from transactions that wouldn't fit in the block. So miners make money off fees. They want to accept as many transactions as possible. So if he sets that limit too low, he's going to be cutting out on his costs because he's not going to be getting those transaction fees for processing those transactions that are bigger, those blocks that are bigger than maybe if he only sets this to 4 megabytes, if it's an 8 megabyte block or whatever. So anyway, other concerns and controversy. I mentioned earlier that Segwit has a lot of technical, economic, and potential implications around it. So this is where it begins to get a little bit more into it. I note that the proposals Okay, I will now elucidate on some of these concerns. I note that the proposals to raise the block size limit have little or no implications other than the fact that they're processing more transactions, require more storage space, and network bandwidth. You're going to need faster internet as well for these bigger blocks. Although I have heard this increase in bandwidth could cause trouble for nodes/miners behind the Great Firewall of China. I have not researched this and do not know if it's true. Research that, guys, and let me know in the comments section what you guys think about bandwidth and the Great Firewall of China's limits for Chinese miners. It would be interesting, right? Because a lot of the talk we hear from the Segwit crowd is that China is centralizing by having bigger blocks. And you should have smaller blocks because it allows more people around the world to buy cheaper storage space. But what he is implying here is that actually this would be bad for China, bigger blocks, ultimately. It might cause trouble for them due to communist China's bandwidth issues. So one of the most troubling aspects of Segwit is the fact that from its inception, it has been promoted primarily by use of censorship, deception. This is true to me. I mean, it's just absolutely true. Censorship, deception, bullying, inciting fear and divisions, and other such chicanery that has absolutely no place in an open source project. Open source meaning you can go to github.com, look at the Bitcoin source code, request to change a part of that code, and say why. You get a say in that system. It's open source. You get to look at all of that stuff. Shouldn't be about fear and deception. It should just be about open discussion. I emphasize that this is not mere conjecture. The use of censorship on the main Bitcoin discussion channels, such as the r/Bitcoin subreddit and bitcointalk.org, to suppress all these discussions of problems or disadvantages of Segwit is well documented. So make sure you click on that link that I'll put in the description, because you'll be able to click on that documentation if you're interested in seeing his references for that. While these same discussion channels allow overt bullying of any users who question Segwit, your thread will be deleted. And if you talk about anything that's related to Bitcoin, but not Bitcoin in the vision that they see on the r/Bitcoin subreddit, then you will be banned temporarily or permanently. Segwit proponents have repeatedly used divide and conquer strategies to attempt to play one demographic of Bitcoin users, such as users, miners, exchanges, merchants. Everybody has a different way of looking at this, against one another, attempting to scare both sides into embracing Segwit as a security blanket. For example, Segwit is frequently pushed by people making wild and unfounded conjectures about retroactive forks and replay attacks, stealing users' money, and advising users to contact merchants to demand Segwit support to avoid this possibility. Cooler heads will note that people will usually see any significant chain reorganization coming in order to steal people's funds. They'll see that happening, and any serious attempt to fork the chain will include replay attack prevention, such as Bitcoin Cash, which replay attack prevention is when we fork, we create two different versions of Bitcoin, like we did recently, the segregated witness version and the Bitcoin Cash version. Then what you get is that they both came from the same transaction history, they both have the same wallet address history, and you have an issue because right after the fork, you could technically send transactions between both unless you protect against that. And you could do double spending of Bitcoin that don't exist or you might not have, whatever, on both different chains. It causes a lot of issues. So you have to have that protection in place. Bitcoin Cash was proactive enough, the team who did that, who developed that code, in order to make sure that it took some time for them to separate from each other and to name themselves differently and to get different ticker symbols and to be clear about that so you wouldn't have this kind of replay attack. So it was a serious attempt to fork the chain. Even without knowing anything about Segwit, I can say with certainty that no good idea is ever promoted using censorship or divide and conquer strategies. Good ideas promote themselves, and all effort can simply be spent helping people understand them. There's little documentation which thoroughly describes Segwit, even though it's a massive and complex technical change that completely rewrites the way Bitcoin blocks and transactions are constructed and validated. The bulk of information available about Segwit promotes it based on predicted benefits. And when it comes to the justification for these predictions, typically cites some vague, hand-wavy excuse about it being complicated. But the experts, they figured it out. We can't explain it to you. You won't get it. We get it. Don't worry about it. Criticisms and discussions of the implications of Segwit are extremely difficult to find, which I can only assume is due to the censorship. And since when I did find them, they were grave issues which are not adequately answered. One obvious issue with Segwit is the question as to whether it actually solves any problems we have. Sure, it fixes transaction malleability, but that's easy anyways, and it's not an issue that's seriously bothering anyone right now. The issues that are bothering people are high fees. I think I just sent a transaction on the Bitcoin blockchain that cost me $4. I sent from the Bitcoin Cash one, it cost me about 2 pennies. Myself personally. The issues that are bothering people are high fees and long confirmation times, and no one can provide a simple, clear argument that Segwit will reduce fees or confirmation times because Segwit makes the transaction capacity of blocks complex and variable. Nobody knows how much data those rules have in every single transaction. They're always different. And the best anyone can say is that Segwit will probably increase capacity a little bit eventually, assuming everyone starts using Segwit transactions. Another issue is that Segwit messes around with the fees for the miners, paid to miners in different groups, creating different transaction classes with different fee levels, which will have unknown economic consequences. I would say this is still being debated, but the debate is censored. There are some who think the fees are set up the way they are to subsidize Lightning networks, which probably will solve the scaling issues, but not without trade-offs of their own, and Lightning networks really have nothing to do with Segwit anyways. Lightning network could be implemented without it. Heard that. And although some small modifications would still be needed, it wouldn't be anything as massive or complex as Segwit. Lightning networks, definitely do your research on that. And it's really like the gospel for everyone saying how to scale Bitcoin, which can be done without Segwit. Some say Segwit would make it easier or whatever, but if we did Segwit in the way it changes fee structures, it would give a benefit to those who run the Lightning network or created the Lightning network in a certain way. Lightning networks, in a sense, are it takes me a long time to get you some Bitcoin, to get me some Bitcoin. If we're doing a lot of transactions, if I want to accept Bitcoin at a store for payment, but I want to do a lot of transactions, I don't want to have to wait a long time between them. I can just close a payment channel that I've created between us of trust with some money that I put up in locked up for a little while, some extra Bitcoin that I put locked up, and we can do a bunch of stuff. And then at the end of the day, I close that, and that's the only thing that hits the blockchain. But it's not on the chain. It's not on the Bitcoin blockchain, this Lightning stuff. It just runs alongside the blockchain, this Lightning network that will really streamline, lower fees, and make confirmation times really negligible ultimately, while reducing the size of the blockchain. So you don't need Segwit is the point for that. One of the biggest issues I have with Segwit is the way it's implemented. Segwit starts off by assuming that hard forking Bitcoin is impossible. The claim is just that it's too hard or impractical, but these claims aren't generally backed up. Segwit therefore bends over backwards to implement itself as a soft fork, which means that old Bitcoin wallets will still work, but won't understand the new features. But the astute reader will recall that Segwit, or listener in this case, that Segwit fundamentally alters the structure of blocks and transactions. So how can this possibly be done as a soft fork? The answer is that Segwit uses what is, in my professional opinion, an unthinkable nasty hack. According to the Bitcoin protocol, all Segwit transactions can be spent by anybody with no proof of authorization. That means that literally anyone can make a transaction that spends the Bitcoins in a Segwit address. The witness data, which is the rules for who's allowed to claim the outputs and the proof that the rules were followed on the inputs that claim the outputs, is moved out of the main block and replaced with a simple, anyone can spend me. There are no rules and no proofs. And it's up to the miners to know what the rules are on that extra witness data. Ignore the anyone can spend me instruction actually inside the block, and instead apply the rules from the witness data. There are two major implications to this hack. The first is that Segwit is a one-way ticket. Once it starts, it can never be removed, because to remove the insanely complicated Segwit rules that say ignore what the transaction says and look at the witness data instead would leave only the anyone can spend me without any authorization rule on the Segwit balances. Thus, anyone could steal all the coins in Segwit balances. To remove Segwit, it would be either necessary to keep the insanely complicated rules in play, but disallow new transactions to use them in the future, or convince all Bitcoin users to first move their Bitcoins to a non-Segwit wallet. The first isn't really removing Segwit, since the rules would still be in use. People are just ignoring them. And the second is simply not going to happen, since Segwit proponents will lie and censor, just like they're doing now to promote Segwit, to scare people away from leaving it behind. The second implication is even more chilling. For the first time, The Bitcoin protocol will have official support for the theft of Bitcoins. See, the formal rules of Bitcoin will be anyone can spend these coins without authorization. But the Segwit rules, which all the miners have to look at, will say otherwise. And if they don't, okay, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. This means that anyone who can get a majority of miners to agree to look the other way and ignore the Segwit rules can send a transaction that spends those Bitcoins without authorization, and it will be valid by protocol, the base protocol. At present, if the majority of miners attempted to do this, their blocks would be invalid and ignored by the network because they violate the Bitcoin protocol. That witness data is inside the blockchain. You can't ignore it. But with Segwit, the Bitcoin protocol will only understand the Bitcoin protocol. Anyone can spend these coins. So as long as the miners agree to ignore the Segwit rules, the transaction will pass checks. Obviously, this means that the miners could collude to steal everyone's Segwit balances, or really Bitcoin balances, but more likely, a government could force mining organizations to allow their transactions to steal Bitcoins, reverse transactions, or whatever else. Whereas previously, this meddling would have been extremely noisy, causing a hard fork, which likely would have been ignored. With Segwit, however, theft by miner collusion is a first-class feature. That's pretty scary, right? For all the people who are all about not letting governments mess with our funds by taking control of just a few individuals or one sect of individuals. Considering they're researching quantum computers and stuff, that's pretty crazy. So now I'd like to set aside all of the details above and simply ask, what is good about Bitcoin? In my views, the best things about Bitcoin are its simplicity, its security, and its mind share. Bitcoin is the first blockchain, and it's probably the simplest as well. This elegant simplicity makes it easy to understand, which in turn makes it easy to trust. It's also the best known and most widely used cryptocurrency in existence. Segregated witness is systematically destroying everything good and worthwhile about Bitcoin. Segwit is inelegant and complicated. It creates two parallel sets of rules for validating transactions, but ignores one of them. Segwit breaks Bitcoin security by empowering miners and anyone who coerce them to steal balances. And Segwit is breaking the Bitcoin ecosystem, not just miners, any nodes, I would imagine. And Segwit is breaking the Bitcoin ecosystem up, causing people to fork the blockchain just to avoid using it, and destroying the mindshare, confidence, and name recognition in Bitcoin. Nathan. That's such an excellent article. Make sure you follow him on Steam, and I definitely did. A mod probe. So, now that we've talked about that, I'm going to wrap up with this article. This is quicker. I hope that was a little bit informing as to how blocks, and now this next bit will make a lot more sense for you. Which is Black Swan event that possibly took place last night that could really put a hamper on Bitcoin today, not within a period of time. Well, actually, it could be within a period of time leading into November, but here we go. It kind of goes a little bit deeper into what I was trying to talk about in yesterday's video. So, the Black Swan that could turn Bitcoin upside down by Bellerophon, 11 days ago. Last week, Bitcoin forked into two competing blockchains, which for the purpose of this article, I will call Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin Segwit. There is one previously unforeseen Black Swan event that could possibly bring the Bitcoin Segwit chain to a grinding halt in the coming weeks. After 4 years of arguing about how to scale Bitcoin, some members of the bigger Blocks faction hard forked on August 1st to form Bitcoin Cash, following Satoshi's original vision of simply increasing the block size, which was expected. The remaining Segwit faction expect to activate their new protocol Segregated Witness on their blockchain in 2 weeks. Well, it's like a week from now, or actually even less, I think on Tuesday of this coming week. Segwit has kept the block size capped at 1 megabyte for the past 4 years, even though this has led to transaction processing delays and skyrocketing transaction fees. Even though Bitcoin Cash is now, I'll add to the last paragraph, and getting people more interested in other chains like Ethereum to avoid the huge fees, transaction confirmation times, and the arguing. So anyway, even though Bitcoin Cash is now separated from the Segwit blockchain, the two are still economically connected by a scarcity of mining hash power because they use the same proof of work algorithm. Remember when I told you that different computers use different algorithms and one might be more profitable? One algorithm, depending on what computer hardware you're using, it's going to be more profitable to mine a certain coin. So Bitcoin Cash still use that same algorithm, so they're competing for the same hardware. Bitcoin transactions are processed by miners who run specialized hardware to solve the math problem called proof of work. This algorithm is solved by custom-made processors called ASICs. There are a limited number of ASIC computers in the world, and nearly all of them are currently employed in mining Bitcoin. This means the supply of Bitcoin mining hash power is inelastic over the short term, but fairly elastic over longer periods that allow for the manufacture and delivery of new ASIC machines. Bitcoin's difficulty automatically adjusts every 2016 blocks to keep the network producing new transaction blocks every 10 minutes. It normally takes 2 weeks to mine 2016 new blocks based on the current difficulty of solving that really difficult math problem for your computer. It takes about 2016 blocks, again, because this is important, to keep the network running fine, and have to change it as necessary. So let's say that a lot of miners leave the Bitcoin network. It would take about 2 weeks if the difficulty stayed the same for it to be lowered. It would take about 2 weeks for it to adjust. And it's been doing that every 2016 blocks to adjust that difficulty as necessary based on the mining power and the competing mining power. When Bitcoin Cash forked away, the initial difficulty of the new chain was the same as a Segwit chain. Same difficulty. Since only a small percentage of miners initially supported Bitcoin Cash, it took over 6 hours to mine the first Bitcoin Cash block. I was watching Kenneth Bozak's channel, YouTube channel, live streaming. He was up all night and it's the afternoon waiting for that first block. I was like, oh, I'm glad I slept. And we had wind that there was so little mining power that was trying to solve this very difficult math problem that was also being solved by Bitcoin, but there weren't enough miners to do it, that was going to take up to 6 days possibly for it to get that first block. So this normally would take 10 minutes, so Bitcoin Cash was taking 36 times longer than Bitcoin Segwit to process the same transactions. It actually happened in, I think, 6 hours because some unknown miner put a crap ton of hot mining power over to Bitcoin Cash, so they sped up that process. The slow initial block production was loudly jeered in social media by the supporters of Segwit, and the price of Bitcoin Cash dropped accordingly for the first 5 days, bottoming around $200 on Saturday. However, the creators of the Bitcoin Cash fork anticipated that they would initially have very little miner support, so they added a second difficulty adjustment rule to reduce difficulty every 12 hours if not enough blocks had been mined. The Segwit, which was, I believe, by 20%. So if every 12 hours enough blocks had not been mined, I believe it was 6 blocks, it would adjust the difficulty down by 20%. It would continue to do that until enough blocks, a reasonable amount of blocks, were mined in the last 12 hours. The Segwit blockchain does not, it's important again, the Segwit blockchain, the one that is being forked, it's going to activate on Tuesday, does not have this emergency difficulty reduction rule and cannot add it without a hard fork of their own. This small feature addition by Bitcoin Cash may have unintentionally exposed an asymmetric vulnerability on the Segwit chain. People are now realizing, hey, shouldn't Segwit have done this too, just in case, the Segwit Bitcoin? So Bitcoin miners tend to choose where to apply their mining power based purely on profitability. The two Bitcoin forks are now competing for a limited pool of mining hash power. The profitability of mining Bitcoin depends on 3 factors. The price of Bitcoin. I can sell Bitcoin a certain price as a miner. Better for me. If it's too low, I'm going to get less money, right, to pay the bills around me. The price of electricity locally, and the mining difficulty. How long it's going to take you to get some Bitcoin in order to sell it, and how much electricity it's going to cost you. More efficient miners are able to solve more blocks at a lower cost of electricity. For this reason, the majority of Bitcoin mining is done in countries with low electricity costs, primarily China and Iceland. Also, where it's cold, it's great to mine because you don't have to spend so much money on loud fans and cooling, so that your hardware lasts a little bit longer, which will further increase your electrical costs if you do have to have a lot more cooling. And in China, it's subsidized, a heavy part of the electricity, by the government, Russia as well. So this chart he shows in the link shows the profitability of mining 2 chains over the past 24 hours. It's actually just changed. So now it's, last I checked, 18% more profitable again to mine Bitcoin Cash. It's officially crossed. It was, when he did this, actually they were running pretty parallel, but now they've crossed, which is interesting. So what he's talking about here is kind of happening. So at the current prices, if the price of Bitcoin Cash remains stable and the difficulty continues to fall every 12 hours, when the difficulty reaches 10% of the Segwit chain, based on what he had put here, it will become more profitable to mine Bitcoin Cash than to mine Segwit. The green and gold lines on chart above will cross, which they have. The Segwit is coming up on its 2-week difficulty adjustment, and based on the hash power, the difficulty is expected to increase by 7%. That will push Bitcoin Cash even closer to profitability. Since about every 2 weeks, the Segwit Bitcoin blockchain checks There are a lot more people mining now. Are there less people? Oh, there are a lot of people now mining Segwit because they want money. They think it's going to go up in price. So let's adjust the difficulty up by 7%. We'll see you in 2 weeks. And that's going to make Bitcoin Cash look even more profitable. Less people competing for that reward. So the runaway scenario. By the end of the first week, the difficulty of Bitcoin Cash had fallen to 17%. Of that of the Segwit chain. It is expected that if the profitability of the Bitcoin Cash chain surpasses that of Segwit, some miners will make the rational decision from self-interest and start redirecting their machines to mine the Bitcoin Cash chain instead of Segwit. However, this would cause a runaway scenario. If the Segwit blockchain loses a significant amount of hash power from miners jumping to the other chain, the Bitcoin Cash chain, which is what we're seeing today, it will have major slowdowns and delays in transaction processing. Part of the reason that the fork even happened was because it was already slow and had a huge backlog. Because Segwit has no built-in mechanism to reduce difficulty, it will take 2 weeks before the difficulty would be reduced. And even then, the current difficulty algorithm limits reductions to 75% in one period. That might not be enough. Thus, a migration of 25% of the mining hash power to the Bitcoin Cash chain could result in the main Bitcoin Segwit blockchain slowing substantially. This in turn could cause a panic crash of the Bitcoin Segwit's price on the exchanges, pushing the profitability of mining Segwit even further underwater. If the panic and ensuing price crash were large enough, the hash power for the Segwit blockchain might fall so much as miners look to make more profit and they keep switching over to keep themselves afloat that it takes more than 2 weeks to reach the end of the 2016 block period, because it's about 2 weeks, could be longer, when the next difficulty adjustment is made. Consider that if the hash power fell by 50%, it would take 4 weeks instead of 2. If the hash power fell by 75%, it will take 8 weeks. If it falls by 90%, it will take 20 weeks to reach the next difficulty adjustment, because they didn't put that difficulty adjustment code in there. So this scenario assumes that the miners make decisions purely pragmatically on the basis of profitability. Undoubtedly, some miners are ideologically motivated and might continue to mine the Segwit chain even if the profitability went negative. But that costs them money in the form of electricity, and there is a limit to how long any organization can afford to operate at a loss. Miners also have to consider the damage that would be done to Bitcoin as a whole if the Segwit chain suddenly died. Even if Bitcoin Cash survives, this Black Swan event might significantly reduce the market value of Bitcoin for a long time, cutting into profits. On the other hand, it will only take a few miners jumping chain to start the process. Once that process begins, a race to the bottom might ensue. This scenario seems improbable unless Core is successful in blocking Segwit2x. This is important. This scenario seems improbable, unlikely. It seems more likely today than it did when he wrote this. Unless Core is successful in blocking Segwit2x from activating on November 1st. At that point, well, just to go on that, they are trying really hard to make Segwit2x, which is a New York agreement, from activating on November 1st. What is the New York agreement? In New York, at the Consensus 2017 event, I repeat, there was a decision by the biggest companies, BitPay, Coinbase, Kraken. These companies agreed, you know what, we've been fighting for years, let's do a compromise. Let's stop fighting like babies, like kids. You guys can have segregated witness first, which is where we're at. You guys can have it on the main chain, but after that, let's get 2 megabyte blocks in as well. So we'll appease the miners, we'll appease the companies, everybody wins, right? And then you had a group of sneaky individuals who were like, yeah, we'll sign that. But you had some companies but not really intending to follow on with it because they just wanted segregated witness first, and then the hard fork to them seems optional because they're like, you know what, we're not going to upgrade to that hard forking software later on. They don't have to. They'll just convince people that that they don't have to do that. At that point, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. Right now, it's more important we get segregated witness activated. So yeah, sure, let's do that. Let's do that compromise. We're gonna do that. By the way, this is not the first time it happened, which is why I mentioned that it happened actually in Hong Kong. At the Hong Kong agreement was already broken, so the individuals signing this were likely to break it again. Point is, they have been very adamant, these Core or Blockstream guys, in getting people riled up to not activate it, trying to convince individuals, to convince the companies like Coinbase that did sign the paperwork to not honor the hard fork part of it. But in my opinion, you have a company that has the reputation on the line, agreed to this, and is very careful on what they sign. They will hard fork on November, or they will lose a lot of reputation. And you have BitPay. They really were at the frontier, the pioneers of having merchants everywhere around the world accepting Bitcoin and making money that way, allowing people to pay in Bitcoin. They don't really merchants wouldn't hold the Bitcoin; it just changed for local stuff. But they have merchants everywhere at least aware of Bitcoin, and they have been big. Coinbase as well. So now you have a group that is saying, no, we already got Segwit. Let's not do that hard fork. Let's convince everybody that that hard fork would be bad. We already got Segwit. We can fix everything right now. And they kicked out the lead developer of Segwit2x, Jeff Garzik, yesterday out of the GitHub, open source GitHub of Bitcoin. They kicked him out. They kicked BitPay out. BitPay. And it's funny. To me, it just seems like many people are lost because they're saying, how did Jeff Garzik, and there's this post about how Jeff Garzik was such a great individual, had a great mind, and he was all about decentralization and stuff, and they were just quoting him. I guess someone didn't really understand, and they're just saying, how come he just switched to Segwit2x and wants the hard fork and stuff? You have to realize that this hard fork was made by people of integrity, hopefully to get everybody on the same page. But now we're seeing a divisiveness to say we don't need to do that. And so that idea is really, it's coming to a head now because individuals have been banning people for even talking about the hard fork that some of the biggest companies who have their reputation online agreed to already. So they're pushing the community in two different directions really hard right now. And so what he is saying right here is that in November, when we're supposed to activate the hard fork November 1st, Core is doing their best to be successful in blocking Segwit2x from activating, which would cause a lot of confusion. Imagine that Coinbase does hard fork and calls what they are calling BTC1, which is a hard fork version of it. Coinbase is calling that version of it Bitcoin. That's what they're selling. And then you have different exchanges calling Bitcoin different things. It's going to create a lot of confusion. Not going to be good at that point, which is what I was talking about the video yesterday. But let's just continue here. So at that point, the miners will have to decide whether to fork Bitcoin again, as Segwit2x implied, or simply move their hash power over to the Bitcoin Cash chain. The miners will say, you know what? We're going to move over to Bitcoin Cash, the miners. We don't even want to do that. And then you have companies like Coinbase that are like, well, is Bitcoin Cash now the real Bitcoin? Unlikely. It's probably going to be whatever Bitcoin they hard fork too. And then you have, that's where, now hopefully you're beginning to understand where the confusion lies. So Bitcoin Cash was designed by the mining faction of the Bitcoin scaling debate to keep mining Bitcoin profitable. The Segwit faction has long viewed miners in a negative light. I think there's a reason miners are in the white paper and an integral part of the ecosystem. Just saying. It's a big part of why the network is secure is because you give people some profit for securing and validating transactions. Miners are important. And people would like to paint them in a negative light, but miners are important. Everybody is self-serving, and naturally they're going to be too. Bitcoin Cash was designed by the mining faction of the Bitcoin scaling debate to keep mining Bitcoin profitable. The Segwit faction has long viewed miners in negative light and proposed the Segwit changes to reduce the powers of miners over the Bitcoin network. In the economic nature of competition, this may lead to Bitcoin Segwit losing the support of its miners if Bitcoin Cash is seen as a viable alternative, giving them more profit. With the same hardware. In such a scenario, the only way the Bitcoin Segwit would recover would be to do an emergency hard fork on very short notice to reduce the difficulty. It is unclear whether that is even possible. Some people in the Segwit, so they would have to hard fork anyway. Some people in the Segwit forums are now discussing the vulnerability. He puts a picture of that discussion in the link I'm going to put below. Black Swan. So, you're going to hear also that if miners move over to the Bitcoin Cash blockchain, that difficulty is going to adjust and go higher, and then that'll balance out the profitability. But we're actually seeing Bitcoin Cash shoot up in price. It's going to take in between 12 hours for that difficulty to adjust. It only adjusts by 20%. We're in an interesting period right now, and I hoped to make you guys a little bit more aware of what is going on. I could be completely looking at this wrong, or these articles are completely off. Please let me know in the comments section below. Just intelligent arguments. I do not like the arguments that start with a personal attack on character or intelligence. Like they just show an inability to articulate or to even understand what is happening. So please help me understand if I'm wrong in the comment section below. would love to be wrong about this, or what I'm looking at this wrong, but it just seems so obvious to me, and I need to present the truth to you guys so you guys can do what you really feel you should do and protect yourself. I am so excited about cryptocurrency in general. As I mentioned in my last news video towards the end, I don't think the Bitcoin is the end all do all. Bitcoin Cash could very well do that, or Ethereum or Dash. Bitcoin is in an interesting place right now, and I will continue to follow it so you guys can do what you need to do. So thank you very much. If you enjoyed this video, we're keeping it true here. We're keeping it real, trying to keep it non-biased, but also presenting just the facts, what is going on, and open to facts. If you find any news, share it on our official Facebook group. Make sure you hit like so other people can find this video, and we can grow this discussion in a censored place. I do not delete comments from my group or here unless they're spam referral links. They will be deleted, guys. Or you're an ICO to just trying to join my group. Saw you guys. Sorry you didn't get in. So, much love to you guys. Thank you for entertaining this video. If you managed to catch on the whole time, if it wasn't clear, continue to ask questions below, and I'll try to make it clear for you as possible. And have a wonderful day, guys. I'm Crypto, and peace.